If you're planning your retirement in Canada this year, there's one number on your Service Canada statement that's probably lying to you. $1,507.65. That's the maximum monthly CPP payment for 2026, and it looks like the finish line everyone's racing toward. Only a small fraction of Canadians ever collect that maximum. Most people land closer to $925 a month, which is the actual average CPP payment right now. That gap between what you think you're getting and what actually lands in your account is where a lot of retirement plans quietly fall apart. The advice you've probably heard is simple. Delay CPP until 70 and your payment jumps by 42%. That's true on paper. But if you immigrated to Canada partway through your career, took years off to raise kids, or had stretches of self-employment with gaps in contributions, that same advice can work against you. Waiting longer doesn't fix a short contribution history. Sometimes it just delays a smaller number. I've watched this happen to people who did everything right on paper and still ended up with a pension that didn't match their expectations. We're not talking about pocket change either. Over a full retirement, the difference between calculating this correctly and calculating it the way most guides tell you to can run past $100,000 in lifetime benefits. If you don't understand how your zero contribution years are quietly eating into your average, you're not just leaving money on the table. You're handing it back. None of this is about working harder or earning more. It comes down to which rules you actually know how to use. So let's fix that. There are 7 ways to raise what you actually collect, and the first one starts with a rule most people calculate backwards. CPP doesn't average every year you've ever worked. Your contributory period runs from your 18th birthday to the month you start your pension, which for someone retiring at 65 works out to 47 years. The general dropout provision automatically removes your 8 lowest earning years from that stretch, about 17% of the total, before your average gets calculated. On its own, that dropout can move someone off the average of roughly $925 a month by $50 or more, without a single extra dollar of contributions. This is where most people get the strategy backwards. If you've already worked 40 solid years at decent income, taking a low-paying bridge job at 62 doesn't automatically help your CPP. You've likely already used your 8 dropout years on the genuinely weak stretches from earlier in your career. A new low-income year just gets averaged into everything else, and it can pull your number down instead of up. Those dropout years could be stretches you were between jobs, back in school, or going through a rough patch financially. They get erased from the calculation entirely, as if they never happened. Take 2 people retiring at 65 with otherwise identical 40-year earning histories. One has 7 zero income years scattered through their 20s. The other has none. Once the dropout removes those 7 weak years for the first person, their monthly CPP numbers can end up nearly the same. You aren't a low earner just because you moved to part-time work in your early 60s. You're someone who needs to know when another year of contributions actually helps your average, and when it's just extra work for the same check. That's a different question than most people are asking. There's a real cost to getting this backwards. Someone who keeps working past the point where it helps their CPP average isn't building a bigger pension. They're often working an extra year for a number they'd have gotten anyway, while assuming the opposite is true. But 8 years of dropout isn't the end of the story. If you spent more than that raising children, there's a second provision built specifically for that gap, and almost nobody uses it correctly. The 8-year dropout helps most people. But if you immigrated to Canada at 33, arrived with no Canadian contribution history, and then took years off to raise young children, 8 years often isn't enough to protect your average. This is where the child rearing provision comes in, and it's the part of the CPP formula most newcomers never hear about. The CRP lets you remove additional years beyond the standard 8 for any period you were the primary caregiver of a child under 7. It's stacked on top of the general dropout, not instead of it. It doesn't matter which country you contributed from before landing in Canada, only how many caregiving years you can actually document once you're here. In practice, that looks like this. A mother who stayed home for 7 years across 2 children doesn't just get the 8-year general dropout. She can also have those 7 caregiving years removed, for 15 years total, taken out of her average. For someone who also lost years to immigration timing, that's the difference between a CPP calculation built on 32 working years instead of 47, and one that's honest about which years actually count. I used to think the CRP was something built mainly for stay-at-home moms from a previous generation. The more cases I've seen, the more I've realized it's actually one of the most useful tools for immigrant families trying to catch up to a standard 40-year Canadian contribution history. There's a cost nobody usually explains here. If you don't claim the CRP, those child-rearing years don't just sit there neutrally. They get counted as zero income years and averaged into your pension permanently. That's a lower CPP payment for the rest of your life, based on years you spent working just as hard, raising a family instead of drawing a paycheck. And this part matters. Service Canada doesn't always apply the CRP automatically, even when your tax records show you had children in that window. You need to request it yourself on the ISP 1000 application form when you apply for your pension. Skip that step, or have a previous advisor who never mentioned it, and those years stay counted as zeros. Now for the part of this that causes the most disagreement at kitchen tables across the country. Should you take CPP at 60 or hold out for 70? Everyone who has looked into CPP timing runs into the same rule: take it early, at 60, and your payment shrinks by 0.6% for every month before 65, up to 36% lower. Wait past 65, and it grows by 0.7% a month, up to 42% higher at 70. Written out like that, it looks like a simple math problem. It isn't. Most retirement calculators and articles will tell you the break-even age between starting CPP at 60 and starting at 65 is around 74. That number gets repeated so often that people assume it also applies to the choice between 60 and 70. It doesn't. When you compare taking CPP at 60 against waiting the full 10 years to 70, the real break-even point lands much later, typically somewhere in the early to mid-80s, depending on your specific numbers. That gap matters because of how CPP actually gets paid out. If you start at 60, you collect 120 monthly payments before someone who waited until 70 sees their first check. 10 full years of income, smaller as it is, land in your account before their bigger number even starts. Now think about 2 different paths through retirement. One person waits until 70 for the largest possible check, but draws down their TFSA and RRSP hard in their 60s to cover living costs while they wait. If a health crisis hits at 68, they're left with a maxed out future CPP payment and very little cash sitting in reachable accounts today. Call that the fragile path. The other person takes CPP at 60, keeps their savings largely intact, and simply invests the monthly CPP income they're not otherwise using. They reach that break-even point in their 80s, with both a functioning income and a cushion still sitting in reserve. Call that the resilient path. None of this means taking CPP at 60 is automatically the right call, or that waiting until 70 is a mistake. It depends on your health, your family history, and how comfortable you are carrying uncertainty for 2 more decades. Wanting your money sooner because your own health history says you may not see 85 isn't a failure of planning. It's just a different set of odds than the calculator assumes. If any of this sounds closer to your situation than the standard advice you've been given, That's exactly the kind of thing this channel is built around. Stick with me, because there's a tax trap waiting at 65 that can quietly claw back every extra dollar you worked to get by waiting. Picture someone we'll call David. He followed the delay strategy exactly the way it's usually described, holding off on CPP until 70, so his monthly payment climbed toward $2,000. On paper, that's a win. But David also has a workplace pension and RRSP withdrawals. And once you add his delayed CPP on top, his total income for the year crosses $100,000. That number matters more than most people realize. The OAS clawback, officially called the recovery tax, starts at $95,323 in net income for 2026. Above that line, you lose 15 cents of OAS for every extra dollar you earn. David built his CPP up specifically to have more money in retirement, and that same decision just triggered a bill he didn't budget for. The reason it's such an easy trap to miss comes down to timing. OAS for the current quarter pays a maximum of $742.31 a month for someone between 65 and 74. Lose all of it to the clawback, and that's nearly $8,900 a year gone. On top of the tax you're already paying on the income that pushed you over the line in the first place. Nobody sits down and decides to give that money back. It happens quietly, one tax slip at a time, well after the CPP timing decision has already been locked in. This is where the framework we've been building actually pays off. Someone who understands their own numbers might deliberately take CPP a little earlier, not because they need the cash right away, but to use those lower income years in their early 60s to fill up tax brackets before mandatory RRIF withdrawals begin at 72. Taking income sooner, when your total income is lower, can end up costing less in clawback than taking a bigger CPP payment later, on top of everything else that's about to land in the same tax year. None of this is really about CPP in isolation. It's about which year the money shows up in and what else is already sitting in that year's tax return next to it. If you're married or common law, there's one more move here that most people never use, a way to effectively share some of this income with a spouse and soften the whole picture. If you're married or in a common law relationship, CPP has a pension sharing option that a lot of couples never look into. It's not the same as splitting your income for tax purposes. Pension sharing lets you reallocate the portion of CPP you both earned during the years you lived together, moving some of the higher earner's benefit onto the lower earner's return. Done right, it can lower the household's total tax bill without changing the combined amount coming in. There's a harder conversation hiding behind that one, though, about what happens when one spouse passes away. A lot of couples plan as if two CPP checks simply continue side by side for as long as either of them is alive. They don't. When one spouse dies, the survivor doesn't get to add both pensions together. The combined amount is capped at the maximum single retirement pension, which sits at $1,507.65 in 2026. If both spouses were already receiving close to that individually, the survivor's household income can drop by close to half overnight, even though their monthly expenses barely move at all. Think back to 2008 for a second. Plenty of couples got through that market crash fine on paper because two full CPP checks kept covering the basics while their RRSPs recovered. What actually broke some of those households wasn't the market. It was losing a spouse years later and discovering the CPP income had been quietly capped the whole time without anyone explaining it in advance. I've seen this exact situation play out with a woman I'll call Linda. She lost her husband and was stunned to find her household income had dropped by about $1,100 a month, almost entirely because of this survivor cap. Nothing about her spending had changed. The floor under her just got lower, and nobody had warned her it was coming. This is why pension sharing and survivor planning need to happen together, not as two separate conversations years apart. Understanding the cap now, while both of you are still receiving CPP, is what lets you plan around it instead of discovering it during the hardest year of your life. It's not a complicated form to fill out. It just has to actually get filled out by both of you while there's still time to plan around it together. So how do you actually put any of this into motion? It starts with logging into a government system that a surprising number of people simply can't get into. There's one more way to raise your CPP that most people ignore completely because it looks like a cost instead of a benefit. If you're under 65 and still working while collecting CPP, contributing on that income is mandatory. Between 65 and 70, it becomes optional, and this part is worth knowing. Every year you keep contributing during that window adds a small, permanent addition to your monthly CPP for the rest of your life, called the post-retirement benefit. It's not a large number in any single year, but stacked over several years of part-time or contract work in your 60s, it adds up to a real, permanent increase on top of whatever your base CPP already is. A lot of people stop contributing the moment they're allowed to, without realizing they're also stopping a small but guaranteed raise. So where do you actually start putting this together? First, log into My Service Canada account and pull up your statement of contributions. If the site gives you trouble, you can also get in using your bank as a sign-in partner, the same option available through the CRA. Once you're in, look through your contribution history for the years marked with an M for maximum. Those are your strongest years, and they're the ones the dropout provisions are designed to protect. Second, count your zero income years by hand. If you have more than the standard 8 covered by the general dropout, and you don't have child rearing provision years to claim against the rest, taking CPP earlier is very often the stronger math, simply because you're not gaining much by waiting on an average that's already being dragged down. Third, if any of those 0 years line up with time spent raising a child under 7, go back and make sure you've actually filed for the CRP on your application. That single form is where a lot of this potential increase either gets claimed or quietly disappears. I've spent this whole video walking through how to get more out of CPP. But there's one thing underneath all of it that the numbers alone don't cover. We've covered the 8-year dropout that most people never account for, the child rearing provision that can add years on top of it for immigrant and caregiving families, why the real break-even age for waiting until 70 is later than the number most calculators give you, and the OAS clawback that can quietly undo the benefit of delaying in the first place. CPP isn't a trophy you're trying to max out. It's one tool among several, and the right choice is whichever one lets you sleep at night without worrying about a letter from the CRA or a diagnosis you didn't see coming. If this helped you look at your own numbers differently, subscribe to Brian's Canadian Retirement Playbook so you don't miss what comes next. I'll see you in the next one.